It's great to be back for this, the last of 3 lectures, which will focus, except for the very end, on biblical criticism in Israel and in relation to Israel, both before and after the establishment of the state in 1948. I will also focus a bit on institutions and institutional history, universities, commentary series, because these could also determine how biblical criticism could or could not flourish. The figures are going to be in chronological order today based on their birth dates. I'm going to start with Felix Perles, who was born in Munich into a prominent rabbinic family and received his early Jewish education from his father, Rabbi Joseph Perles, a graduate of the Breslau Rabbinic Seminary. Felix Perles then studied classical and Oriental studies at Munich University. Just to remind you, Jews could not then study Bible in German theology departments. And the first chapter of his dissertation, called Analektin, Gleanings on the Textual History of the Old Testament, was published in 1895. It focused on types of textual errors in the Hebrew Bible, not distinguishing between the Torah and the rest of the Bible. He continued his studies in Vienna and Paris. He was a Zionist who personally knew Theodor Herzl. In 1899, he was appointed deputy rabbi of Königsberg, Prussia, today Kaliningrad, Russia, a position he retained until his death in 1933. He also lectured in Semitic languages at the university in Königsberg, but as a Jew was unable to teach Bible there. He rarely wrote on higher or source criticism, but his approval of that method is explicit in his writing. Unlike Solomon Schechter, whom we looked at last week, Perles wrote positively about the Protestant scholar Harnack. He even wrote a positive review of Wellhausen's 7th edition of his Prolegomena, the introduction in 1914, using it as a call for Jewish scholars to produce similar works. I quote from Perles, "Instead of ignoring or rejecting all results of criticism, Jewish scholars must especially participate independently in critical work." To offer another contrast with Schechter, again returning to last week, Perles applauded some of Delitzsch's works. The inhospitality of German universities to scholarship by Jews on Judaism may explain, in part, Perles's strong interest and hope in the establishment of Jewish biblical scholarship in either the United States or Mandatory Palestine. Perles spent the fall semester of 1922 teaching at the Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. As discussions concerning the opening of the Hebrew University and its Institute for Jewish Studies were being held in Jerusalem and London in 1923 and in the years that followed, the issue of how to handle biblical studies was raised, but not immediately resolved. Some, including Judah Magnus, suggested appointing 2 professors of Bible, one in critical biblical studies, the other in traditional biblical studies. Perles was offered a full-time position as a professor of Bible, but came for only 1 semester in 1927. The lecture I quote from on the following slides is from that period. It was given in an event commemorating the founding of the Institute for Jewish Studies at Hebrew University, and its Hebrew title, which is difficult to translate precisely, is Mahu Lanu Madah HaMikra, which Professor Breuer and I decided to translate, "Why should the scholarly study of the Bible matter to us?" The address is a marvel of Hebrew rhetoric, deeply imbued with references from biblical and to some extent rabbinic literature. Its passion is remarkable, as is its simultaneous interest in fully utilizing mainstream Protestant biblical scholarship, while offering a cri de coeur for developing a characteristically Jewish biblical scholarship in the developing Jewish homeland. This will be one of the motifs of this evening. He writes in this address, "It is therefore incumbent upon me to prove that this science does not come to destroy but to build." That's playing on Jeremiah chapter 1. and in so doing, to return the crown that has been taken from us, playing with a well-known rabbinic phrase. I do not dispute that the path of biblical studies is not yet smoothly paved, and I pray that I do not cause any harm. But the danger will grow even greater as Jewish scholars consider it a luxury to participate in biblical research. This is a criticism against many 19th century scholars of Jewish studies who primarily looked at post-biblical texts. So he said, some consider it a luxury to participate in biblical research, making do by saying, and this is a quotation from Eicha, from Lamentations, away, away, it is impure, impure. If you want to beat the swords, many of you recognize that citation, of some radical non-Jewish critics who set out to disparage our Torah and dishonor our God. Notice these pronouns, and our nation. We must arm ourselves with all the scientific weapons. So he's at war. For it is without that, those who continually decry the damage caused by the scientific study of the Bible know and understand nothing about it, and say things with the authority of a blind person, speaking about shades of color. In other words, those who criticize the most have the least knowledge of biblical criticism. To my regret, I must admit the number of scholars from our nation who work in this field is very small. This is a terrible shame and a great loss, terribly embarrassing. And then he moves back several centuries. In the Middle Ages, Jews excelled in the scientific study of the Bible. And during the Renaissance and Reformation, leading non-Jewish scholars came to the Jews of the ghetto, asking, "Teach us Hebrew and explain the scripture for us, for we know that only you possess knowledge in this discipline." This is a correct historical fact. He wants to go back to the best things of the Middle Ages. We must awaken the Holy Spirit in our midst and approach this task of returning the Bible to our nation. The person who is afraid and weak-hearted, a citation from Deuteronomy, and afraid of the science of the Bible because it includes methods that contradict our established notions, is like a child who is afraid that a doctor will cause him pain with a scalpel and does not understand that he is saving him from much greater pain. Toward the conclusion, he says, we can no longer ignore the scientific study of the Bible. And here I'll just note that in this work, where he uses the Hebrew word madar, and in many other works, scientific reflects the German word Wissenschaft, or science, and this was broadly used for types of academic study within the humanities as well. So we can no longer ignore the scientific study of the Bible, because if we continue to ignore it, we will only help the Christian scholars become stronger. So he's seeing this as a competition. Rather, we need to choose between a science that is filled with a foreign spirit and between a science that is filled with a Holy Spirit, Ruach HaKodesh. It is my hope that the prophecy, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, Torah shall come forth from Zion, will come true in a new sense. Just as the Torah went forth from Israel long ago, so may it be for the future. May the understanding of the Bible come forth from this institute to illumine all the world's inhabitants with the light of this science. And just a quick word about this quote from Isaiah and also Micah, Torah shall come forth from Zion. This was a very important verse associated with the founding of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, used by many figures and used by many figures in very different ways. So for example, at the dedication of the Hebrew University, it was used by the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Palestine, Rav Kook, in the sense that traditional Torah needs to come forth from Jerusalem. Perles is clearly using it in a very different sense. I move on to another very different sort of figure, known by a number of different names, Max or Maxus or Menachem Soloveitchik. When he arrived in Israel, he Hebraicized his last name to Soli Eli. He was born in 1883 to a prominent, well-to-do family in Kovno or Kaunas in Russia, today in Lithuania. He graduated from local gymnasium in 1902 and then studied sciences in St. Petersburg. He was active in Zionist circles at a young age, and in 1904, alongside Vladimir Jabotinsky, was among the founders of an important Zionist journal. He continued his education in the natural sciences in a number of universities, receiving his PhD in chemistry from Grenoble in 1909. Like some of the figures I discussed last week, he was an autodidact in biblical studies. In 1912, he joined with other Jewish maskilim, members of the Haskalah, to launch a book series on Jewish history and culture. The first volume on the biblical period was a reader which included leading German scholars such as Julius Wellhausen. A year later, Soloveitchik published a series of essays on different aspects of biblical scholarship in a Russian-language Haskalah monthly, which was then published as a short book. It was translated into Hebrew by Zalman Rubashoff, who when he came to Israel, when he made Aliyah, Hebraicized his name to Zalman Shazar, and became the third president of Israel. This book was called Rashi Pirakim B'Madei HaMikra, Primary Themes in Academic Biblical Scholarship, which was ready for publication in 1914. It was published by Moriah Publishing House in Odessa, which was established by Chaim Nachman Bialik, the great national Hebrew poet. Bialik was sympathetic to biblical criticism and encouraged Rubashoff and Soloveitchik in their work. When Lithuania became an independent state in 1918, Soloveitchik was appointed Minister of Jewish Affairs in the Lithuanian government. In 1922, he moved to London to work with the Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann. They had significant clashes, and Soloveitchik left London for Berlin in 1923, where he helped edit the German Encyclopedia Judaica. There he worked with Bialik to establish Dvir Mikra, an imprint of the Dvir Publishing House, the famous Hebrew publishing house established by Bialik. And you could see that the book on the right says that is part of the series of Madei HaMikra, and it has the imprint of Dvir Mikra. And in 1924, the first book to be published under this imprint was Soloveitchik's picture book, Sechiot HaMikra, Treasures of the Bible, which was soon translated into German and English. It was in 1925, under that same imprint, that Soloveitchik and Rubashoff finally published their decade-long project, Toldot Bikoret HaMikra, the history of biblical criticism that you see on this slide. Soloveitchik emigrated to Israel in 1933 and died in 1957. He opens his earlier book by saying that its purpose is to encourage readers to understand the current research of the biblical world and its great and eternal spiritual legacy. We're going to hear the word spiritual. He uses the Hebrew word ruchani very often. He talks about the Bible as the wellspring of Israel's spiritual culture. This return to the Holy Scripture will only come after creative, thoughtful work that draws close to the inner spirits of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Holy Scriptures are distant, now this is quite striking, to both the religiously observant and to the enlightened among us. That book does not occupy its proper place with any of these folks, and he is trying to reestablish its proper place. But how should this be done? He says, all told, it is possible to penetrate into the world of the Bible only, that's an important word, through biblical scholarship. The role of this endeavor within Judaism is not to destroy, but to construct. Again, Jeremiah chapter 1. Indeed, it is the case that when we approach the Bible armed, Again, note the military language. With current critical research methods, both historical and literary, we may sometimes need to reevaluate traditional values. But as a result of such clarification, the creative thinking of Jews will spread and become self-aware. In place of a holy mantle of darkness, we will find in the Holy Scriptures a trustworthy basis for the creative national spiritual work that awaits us. Soloveitchik was an important nationalist, and certainly later in his life a Zionist, and thought very much in terms of national spiritual work for the Jews. He continues by saying we must gird ourselves for a battle of public opinion. He knew very well many people opposed this method. This will certainly be most a difficult battle, since many Jews will undoubtedly see it as the shaking of the foundations of Judaism and endangering its very existence. They forget that it is no accident that the Holy Scriptures occupy such an exceedingly important place in Jewish and world culture, because its special importance does not depend on the holiness that hovers over them. He's delinking the Bible in holiness. Looking at its content in detail will thus not distance Jews from their Holy Scripture. Rather, the opposite is true. It will return to the Jewish people the riches of authentic creativity that is gathered in them. For him, the Bible is the most authentically creative book, and Jews in the early 20th century must return to it, with the hope that this literary work will again become the source of life for the Jewish culture that is withering in our very day. I conclude my treatment of Soloveitchik with the very ending of the book he wrote with Rubashoff, namely Zalman Shazar in 1925. The fear, namely of biblical criticism, is gone. He is unduly optimistic. The worlds have met face to face. Here and there, the first buds have appeared as an expression of the need for transformation and harbingers of change. A generation fearful about the future is listening to the moans of the past. New modern threads are being connected to the classical period in the land of the patriarchs, namely Israel. The time has come for the partition to fall, the partition that stands between the Creator, namely Israel, and the creation, namely the Bible, and the scholarly work that evokes its surroundings. And he concludes, notice the agricultural image, which is so fitting for Israel, or more properly mandatory Palestine, in 1925. The plow has tilled the forsaken field, and the first new buds of this early century have appeared. Children of old age, born to Jewish biblical criticism that is as old as the Bible itself. I mentioned this in the first presentation. He and some other scholars believed, to my mind not correctly, that biblical criticism is as old as the Bible or the Talmud. He continues, with much hesitation and measured steps, and belatedly, Jewish critical thought is coming into its own. And who knows, maybe gates that have been locked until now will open up in the future when the Master himself will knock on their door. This last sentence is incredibly elusive. It follows a well-known midrash or story in Genesis Rabbah. In terms of knocking on doors, it is referring to Song of Songs or Canticles chapter 5, verse 2. And in terms of doors opening, it is also referring to the final prayer of Yom Kippur, namely the Ne'ilah prayer. So what is so remarkable about what they're doing here is they are using very traditional Jewish sources, but in an image to insist on the importance of biblical criticism. But how should this be done in the world of education? So here I come to our third figure, Ben-Zion Mossinsohn, who was born in a small town in southern Russia. He received traditional Jewish education that focused on rabbinic texts, but at 16 went to study at gymnasium and qualified for a teaching degree. He was also drawn to regional Zionist circles headed by Menachem Usishkin, a leading Russian Zionist. In 1902, he enrolled at the university in Bern, Switzerland, where a variety of Jewish socialists, anarchists, nationalists, and Zionists then lived. He attended the 1903 Zionist Congress in Basel, where he spoke out against the controversial Uganda plan. At the university, Mossinsohn studied Semitic languages and Old Testament with Karl Marci, a well-known and respected Protestant scholar who admired Wellhausen. Marci was also recognized for his genuine friendliness to his Jewish students. Mossinsohn wrote his dissertation using the Regnan source-critical and historical approaches on the place of Palestine in the pre-exilic literature of the Hebrew Bible. Mossinsohn moved into Palestine in 1907 and joined the faculty of the Gymnasia Haivrit, the Hebrew gymnasium in Jaffa. You can see a picture of what it looked like in one of its incarnations, where he was initially a teacher of Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible. He became its director in 1912 and served that role with some interruptions until 1940. When he died in 1942, the schools of Tel Aviv closed in tribute on the day of his funeral. A street in that city is named after him. In 1910, only 3 years after arriving in Palestine, Mossinsohn published an essay titled Teaching Tanakh in School in HaChinuch, a Hebrew periodical and the first in Palestine to be aimed at professional teachers. This was an extremely controversial article that he wrote, and there were many articles that were written discussing what he had written and discussing his proposals for education at the gymnasia. So let's hear them. One of the more difficult and thorny questions, he says, regarding Hebrew education is without doubt the question of how to teach the Tanakh in school. By the way, it's equally thorny in Israel in 2023. On the one hand, it is increasingly clear that there is a need to utilize the Book of Books in school, not only as a handbook for learning language, religion, or history, but to render it as a pillar of education of the younger generation. On the other hand, there's a growing recognition that this book cannot be placed into the hands of children as is, for reasons of form and content. And here what he means is the Bible is simply too hard. And what he advocates for is simplifying the Bible and correcting its text so it will be easier for children to read and teachers to teach. He has a motto. It is a return to the Tanakh. He seems to be the person who originated that motto. We need to do that if we want to know it as it was fashioned and understood in the period in which it was produced. When we return to the Tanakh, we will find that within it is a treasure collection, an entire literature of close to 1,000 years, with differences not only between each book, but often even sections of books that differ from one another. Now here he is in a nutshell embodying what historical criticism is all about. The Bible was written over a long period by many authors, and not by a single author with a capital A. The books themselves, whether the Torah or certain prophetic books like Isaiah, are composite books, and is happy to say so in a totally straightforward way. He says, the book is the only mirror in which our luminous past life is reflected. And Professor Breuer and I translated this carefully. The word only is there. And please note, he means it. For him and others of this generation, the central Jewish text that needs to be taught is the Bible, and not the Talmud and other rabbinic texts. Thus, the book is the only mirror. As for the children of a poor and weak nation, one that wandered without land and language, dispirited and downtrodden by its circumstances, no totally negative depiction of what diaspora Jewry was like. This is the only source of aspiration to a different life, a life of freedom and respect. There is no doubt that our national existence is dependent on this aspiration. Wow, what a strong claim. And without it, the image of God, think of Genesis chapter 127, would have already been wiped from our faces. He goes on to talk about how do we need to teach. No doubt we have to turn to biblical criticism, which is so broad and rich among foreign scholars, but whose sprouts have only recently begun to show themselves among us. Here we touch among one of the most difficult questions of the study of Tanakh, the question of corrections and emendations. We talked about this a little bit in a previous lecture about Mossinsohn, who was insistent that we have the Hebrew text exactly preserved in its original form. Mossinsohn says the opposite. The Bible, in a sense, was a book like other books, and like Perles, talked about various errors that transpired that need to be corrected. But he's aware of the problem of this claim, and he says, the value and sanctity of the book are not diminished in the eyes of the students by such emendations, but rather the opposite, because it reads more clearly and as a better book. Like the others we've seen, he's realistic. He says, I know that this essay will arouse opposition and bitterness. We are under attack by biblical criticism, many will exclaim. Such criticism is the offspring of non-Jews, others will add. Perhaps biblical criticism is good in and of itself, but it has no place in a school for young children, yet others will say. Let me remind you of Hershenson last week. That is precisely what he said. He objected to what Mossinsohn was doing in the gymnasia, although he was somewhat open to the critical study of Bible at the Hebrew University. Mossinsohn continues, however true it is that biblical criticism is a Gentile endeavor, and that this is its big drawback, it is also the cause of our great shame. Christian scholars are without doubt biased by the preconceptions that influence their criticism. In other words, the fact that for them, the Hebrew Bible, or more properly, the Old Testament, is part of a larger Bible, followed by the New Testament. But Mossinsohn continues, but to dismiss their biblical criticism entirely is impossible. Despite all its shortcomings, biblical criticism has also devoted much research to the language of Scripture, as well as the forms of Hebrew poetry, in addition to the ancillary fields of biblical scholarship, such as history of Israel and the surrounding nations, history of religious beliefs, and more. This research has provided a basis upon which we can presently build, and our edifice will certainly be different from their edifice. And just to be clear, Mossinsohn was not insisting that biblical criticism needs to be taught from the very beginning, but was clear that the people teaching Bible needed to be aware of biblical criticism and to integrate it well into how they taught the Bible. The next figure I'd like to touch on briefly is Harold Marcus Wiener, who is not a well-known figure. But part of the goal of the project that Professor Breuer and I are working on is to recover periods who are very important in their own time period, even if they are now largely forgotten. Wiener is often quoted positively by Hertz in his Pentateuch, which I discussed last week, and he is one such figure that we are trying to recover. Wiener was born in 1875 to an Ashkenazi father of a family of distinguished Dutch-Belgian engravers and a Sephardic mother connected by birth and marriage to the Anglo-Sephardic aristocracy. He graduated from Cambridge University as a Whewell Scholar for Excellence in International Law and was admitted as a barrister at the Venerable Lincoln's Inn. This is a big deal. He was an active member and officer in a number of traditional synagogues and Jewish schools. He had neither rabbinic training nor apparently any formal academic training in biblical scholarship, but at some point in his 20s, he became obsessed with biblical criticism. Of independent means, Wiener devoted considerable time and energy to trying to refute higher criticism, producing over 50 articles and at least 8 books, typically written in a vituperative style. Many of these were published in evangelical Protestant journals. He was the Jewish darling of this group. Wiener was killed in the anti-Jewish riots in 1929, 5 years after immigrating to Israel. He's a lawyer, so he believes that the critical case on the laws, namely the model that Wellhausen had used for understanding the development of different legal corpora in the Hebrew Bible, in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, those laws, he claims, can only be considered by historical lawyers. In other words, he's claiming his legal training in history of law, gives him the right to understand what this material really means. Furthermore, his other claim is that historical textual criticism is capable of giving sounder and more scientific explanations of many facts on which higher criticism sought to build its documentary theory. In other words, he's claiming that higher criticism, the notion of sources, J, E, D, and P, is entirely wrong, and that textual criticism can totally solve these problems. So thus, even though Hertz quotes him extensively, he is very much a biblical critic, but only dealing with the textual matters, claiming that the biblical text is not properly preserved, and rejecting the notion that the Torah itself is a composite document of 4 or more. He claims our relation to the Bible is different from that of any other people. I know this is sounding like a bit of a broken record today, but this is a really important Jewish claim. To others, it could just be the Bible. To us, it is that, but not only that. And this is an amazingly nuanced sentence. It is under God, a creation of our own genius, at once a child and parent of our spirit, and so forth. And he, in an essay published posthumously called The Need for Jewish Biblical Scholarship, he claims, it is in the service of biblical scholarship, in the fight for the truth, remember this word truth, it's going to keep coming up, that we may learn to know the hidden reserves of strength that inhere in Judaism and the Jewish spirit, and win back the only use of that faculty to the immeasurable benefits once more of all peoples alike. In other words, he's not only looking inward, but he's looking outward as well. The power to create, which for him is only found in the Bible, can be ours once more. To recover it is our right and our duty, as well as our greatest need. And as far as we know, the final form of this essay was written when he already was in the land of Israel. In terms of impact on the Jewish study of the Bible, Nehama Leibovitz, who preferred to be simply called a Nehama, may be the most influential figure I am discussing. She was born to an observant Zionist-leaning family in Riga. Her father was a businessman, was her first teacher of Hebrew and its commentaries, as well as Hebrew language, which was used in her home alongside German, Yiddish, and Russian. She studied in German private schools until her family moved to Berlin in 1919, where she attended gymnasium. She enrolled in the University of Berlin for her first degree, where she was exposed to critical scholarship. We have her transcripts. And she studied Assyriology, biblical theology, and history of religion. She concurrently took classes at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. The great scholar and reform leader, Abraham Geiger, was its first president. Among those studying alongside her at the Hochschule was Leo Strauss, the great historian of philosophy who later taught at the University of Chicago, and they exchanged private lessons. She tutored him in medieval Hebrew philosophical texts, while he read Greek philosophical texts with her. She then enrolled for the PhD at Philipps University in Marburg, where she studied philosophy, English, and German philology, but took only one course in biblical studies. Her doctoral work, completed in 1930, was in German linguistics, with her dissertation on early Judeo-German translations of Psalms. There, she developed an interest in stylistics and literature that informed her life work. After completing her doctorate, she migrated to Mandatory Palestine, where she taught at various teachers' seminaries. In 1937, she began to disseminate her Gilionot, mimeographed sheets with questions typically related to the weekly Torah portions, mainly based on medieval Jewish biblical interpreters of the Torah. She continued disseminating and grading them until 1971. They emphasized critical thinking skills, a hallmark of her pedagogy. These and the books based on them offered a nuanced appreciation of the texture of the biblical text. They were wholly uninterested in text or source critical issues of any sorts. She later taught biblical commentaries, literature, education, and pedagogy of the Bible at Bar-Ilan University and at Tel Aviv University, where she became a tenured professor of Bible education in 1968, and later in the education department in the overseas program at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She was never appointed a professor in the Bible department at any of these universities, who viewed her as a Bible educator. Indeed, in 1956, she received the Israel Prize in Education. Leibovitz's influence extended well beyond the walls of the academy. One of her students summed up her goals well. I quote, "Nehama did not teach Tanakh or Mikra, but Torah in the deep Jewish sense of the word, end quote. She only very rarely quoted Christian biblical scholars, and then it was typically to disparage them, saying that their Hebrew skills were inadequate, or their Christian bias involved denigrating Judaism, claims we have previously seen. The letter that I cite on the following slides deals specifically with Jewish critical biblical scholarship. I apologize that Nehama is the only woman I am discussing. Few women dealt with the issues that I am focusing on in this lecture series. And finally, I just point out her incredibly touching tombstone, which simply says, and this is how she wanted to be remembered, Nehama Leibovitz, Morah. Nehama Leibovitz, a teacher. I want to thank Professor Mira Ofran, Professor Emerita of the Hebrew University, Nehama's niece, for sharing the original of this document from late in Nehama's life with me and Professor Breuer. Although the letter that elicited it is no longer extant, its background seems to be relatively clear. Nehama gave lectures all over Israel, except for bringing her parents on Aliyah. Once she herself made Aliyah, she never left the country. And one of the places she lectured in was the Tel Aviv synagogue of Rabbi Yehuda or Leo Ansbacher. And there she taught in her typical way. And it is clear that she must have quoted some non-observant biblical Jewish scholars, such as Beno Yaakov or Martin Buber. And somebody must have sent an angry letter, and here in this letter she responds. It is correct that I cite those who are not observant, when I agree with what they say and their comments reveal the light of Torah and show its greatness and holiness to the students. I follow the rule, accept the truth from whoever says it. What can I possibly say? And here she's talking about Benno Jakob, who was a rabbi, Reform rabbi in Göttingen, Germany, an important biblical scholar also. So she says Benno Jakob, who was a radical reformer, who presided over Sunday prayers, which, by the way, is probably not historically correct, and certainly transgressed a large number of commandments of our Holy Torah, aside from the fact that he was a radical anti-Zionist, etc., I learned much from his books. He offered excellent proofs concerning the straightforward meaning and showed all sorts of problems with the documentary hypothesis. And all of these underlinings are in the original of this particular letter. And she talks about others, such as Professor Cassuto, Moshe David or Umberto Cassuto, who was teaching at the Hebrew University. She says he was an observant Orthodox Jew, punctilious and zealous in fulfilling the divine commandments. He said some things that differ significantly from my belief in a Sinaitic Torah, and I will not help spread them. And then she notes, therefore I will only consider what is said, not who says it. And she goes on to talk about Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig and their importance for understanding the Bible, even though she has some very, very strong disagreements with Martin Buber. But I would point out, when she says, therefore I will only consider what is said, not who says it, she really does mean only if a Jew is saying it. One of the last figures I would like to discuss is Yehuda Elitzur. And we'd like to thank Professor Elitzur's daughter, Professor Vered Noam, the first woman to win the Israel Prize in Talmud, for this lovely picture of her father. Yehuda Elitzur was born in 1911 as Yehuda Hershkowitz in Budapest, Hungary. His brother-in-law and mentor, Rabbi Professor Shmuel Klein, who later taught geography of the land of Israel at the Hebrew University, adopted Elitzur when his father died in 1926 and took him to Palestine in 1929. Some of you may know the street named after Klein in the German colony. Elitzur studied in various Jewish schools and yeshivas, and in 1940 he completed his master's at Hebrew University in Land of Israel Studies, Talmud, and Biology. He taught Bible at Bar Ilan University in Ramat Gan, Israel, beginning in 1957. Elitzur's work needs to be understood in the academic setting in which he found his home, Bar Ilan University, founded in 1955 as a religious university and as a counterpart to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Pinchas Churgan, Bar Ilan University's first president, framed the school's goals in religious terms, quote, to train a cultured generation in Israel, intellectual leaders who at the same time will be based and rooted in Judaism, to guard the coming generations from an annihilating secularism, end quote. Once the Department of Bible was established at Bar Ilan, it would confront the kinds of problems that Christian divinity schools and other religious institutions faced elsewhere. From what perspective should the Bible be taught? Indeed, until recently, the Torah was viewed with a high level of sanctity and taught only from a traditional perspective there. To the degree that critical methods were used, they were applied only to non-Torah texts. Even so, the department was often criticized. The flagship religious Zionist yeshiva, Merkaz Harav Kook, for example, accused the department of abomination and heresy. Elitzur was central in shaping the department and also an influential force in the Dat Mikra series, a modern religious Hebrew commentary on the entire Hebrew Bible, produced by scholars fully indebted to the tradition, Masoret, and allowing its readers, quote, to hear, understand, and fulfill the words of the one who gave the Torah and its prophets. Their starting point, echoed in Elitzur's essay that I'm about to discuss, was based on the axiomatic principle of David Zvi Hoffman that the entire Torah is true, holy and given from the Almighty. In Dat Mikra, therefore, the standard Hebrew text is never amended, source criticism is completely ignored, and engagement with the text composition or textual history is absent. Yet, they call the commentary a traditional scientific commentary, one that brought contemporary generations, quote, closer to the light of the Torah and to strengthen the pillars of faith. I'm quoting from an essay he wrote in 1966 called Faith and Scholarship in Biblical Interpretation: Principles, Boundaries, and Objectives. It is important to emphasize yet again that from a methodological perspective, biblical criticism might look sophisticated and resplendent, but then he calls it the strangest of sciences. And he starts talking a little bit about source criticism and says that these are only strident conjectures, which are based on evolutionary principles. He continues, straightforward reason suggests that this biblical scholarship, created as it was by German Protestants, shares no common ground except through idiosyncratic Kabbalistic speculations. That is probably a dig at Mordechai Breuer, with the approach of the believer, since belief in revelation is central to the person of faith. But the biblical literary criticism teaches that all of the truths and main theses of the Bible develop from lower to higher notions, from the primitive to the developed, as in all human civilizations. Again, he is criticizing certain evolutionary notions. Clearly, therefore, the contemporary exegete must examine things in light of modern knowledge of linguistics, history, realia, archaeology, and geography, and all the other branches of human knowledge. And that is what he's insisting the religious person must do as well, and must be well versed in these particular areas. But then he asks his central question: isn't biblical criticism representative of contemporary scholarship? Weren't the earlier sages biblical critics in their own ways? Are we not compelled to follow contemporary biblical criticism? It is certainly true that the approach of our predecessors, of our very best exegetes to the Bible, was in their fashion a scientific approach. But, and this highlighting is in the original, it was not the approach of biblical criticism. He goes on to say, what a few superficial intellectuals claim, and by the way, if any of you can find for me who claim this, I will be extremely grateful. Namely, that had Rashi, Rashbam, or Kimchi, three of the great medieval commentators, had they known what we know now from Wellhausen, they would interpret similarly. That, he says, is absolute nonsense. He continues, the boundaries, now he's very interesting in boundary setting, which is often typical of Orthodox Judaism. The boundaries of our interpretations are broad and its methods diverse, but they must all lead to one goal: understanding the truth, we're back to that word, of the Bible, its meaning and its lessons. The Bible is a book of lessons, following the manner and outlook of each exegete. Exploring textual variance, analysis, research, scholarship, a sharp and critical distinction between homiletical meaning, drash, and pshat, and so forth. All of these are permissible. Note he includes textual variance, lower criticism. But when is this so? When these are tools for accomplishing the real work, namely understanding what texts mean in depth. Our earlier sages, however, did not establish precise rules on these matters, but relied on reliable signposts, common sense, belief in the sanctity of the text, and the search for the real truth. And I would just point out that the first and the third of these criteria are not at all objective. One person's common sense is another person's nonsense. One person's and different people's searches for truth may end up in very different places. And I'll just conclude by talking for a moment about a project that I am involved in, namely the Torah.com, which some of you may enjoy, a project which was recently 10 years old, which attempts at making biblical scholarship and academic biblical scholarship widely available to the Jewish and the broader community. Here you see the main four people who are involved in this: David Steinberg, myself, Zev Farber, and David Bar-Cohn. And many scholars have begun to look at this and have asked, has the critical scholarship of the Bible really begun to penetrate into the Jewish community? There have been several scholarly articles about this, but I would simply point out that last year this website had over 4 million hits, which suggests, as does the attendance of the number of people hearing these lectures, that there really has been a change in the Jewish community, including in the more traditional Jewish community, and biblical scholarship is slowly being integrated into the way in which Jews of all stripes view the Hebrew Bible. Thank you very much for your indulgence. I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Brettler. We do have a few questions here. They're sort of long, so let's see how okay. So what is the epistemological value of biblical criticism as compared to the value of trusting the traditional scholarship, given their proximity to the events reported and their understanding of the language in its time?
Okay, it's an excellent question. So I don't know what it means to trust traditional scholarship. I'm not quite sure what traditional scholarship is. The tradition is incredibly variegated, and one scholar differs totally from somebody who might be next to him in the Mikrot Gedolot or the Rabbinic Bible. And of course, the same thing is true of traditional scholarship is seen even in the early rabbinic period. And in terms of another part of that question, indeed, they may have been closer to the biblical period, but these traditional scholars were not very close to the biblical period. They were centuries distant from the biblical period, and in certain areas, such as their understanding of languages, we are now much better off understanding Hebrew on the basis of other Semitic languages that we know. We have a better understanding of biblical geography than many of the scholars who especially were commentating on the Bible outside of the land of Israel. And we have a better understanding of the ancient Near Eastern texts, which are very much the background through which the Bible came into being. So those are the reasons why many people are trying to look at more critical methods of studying the Hebrew Bible, either alongside or instead of more traditional methods.
Okay, I'm asking our audience also try and write maybe shorter questions. Since Professor Brettler can't see them, I'll read them out to them, but some of these are very long. Okay, since Professor Elitzur and others say that criticism enables us to hear, understand, and fulfill the Brit of the Torah. So in your opinion, how have the critics enabled modern Jews, particularly Reform Judaism, to focus on the performance of face-to-face mitzvot, like feeding the hungry, caring for the widows and orphans, welcoming strangers? And these are mitzvot that are more difficult to pray your way out of. I hope that was clear.
I think so. So I'll say, one of the things that biblical criticism by studying ancient Near Eastern texts has shown is that there are certain things, but relatively few things, that are unique to ancient Israel in relation to the ancient Near East. And a set of them are actually the type of commandments or mitzvot that the questioner just talked about, namely certain concerns in the legal tradition for caring for the poor and the disenfranchised. So even though you have these notions in non-legal texts throughout the ancient Near East, you don't see these types of concerns, for example, in the laws of Hammurabi. So studying the Bible critically makes us appreciate even more some of the very good things that are in the Bible and highlight their importance.
Okay. What is the role of Jewish biblical criticism in the context of Protestant churches that concentrate on anti-teachings?
I don't know what anti-teachings
I'm not sure either. I thought you might.
might
Okay.
mean. Anti-Semitic teachings or anti-Zionist teachings.
No, it was the letters anti. Well, we'll ask whoever wrote it to explain, and we'll move on to the next question. What is the most legitimate criticism of biblical criticism?
Oh, that's a hard one. I mean, I must admit, to be honest, that I did not start as a biblical critic. I am a day school graduate. I encountered biblical criticism in college, and it actually took me a semester or so to get into the swing of things. And I just never looked back. I found it incredibly enriching and incredibly convincing. So it's very difficult for me to say what the best criticism is. I mean, I have yet to find something that will convince me that the basic models of higher and lower criticism isn't correct.
Okay, so I was corrected here in the chat that NT is just a short for New Testament.
Question again, please. Yeah.
So the question was, and this is going to be our last question. Sorry, I missed the question. Okay, what is the role of Jewish biblical criticism in the context of Protestant churches that concentrate on New Testament teachings?
There's a big debate within the Protestant church about what is the most important part of the Bible. And actually, one of my colleagues at Duke University, Brent Strawn, has as one of his goals making the broader Protestant community that the Bible that the Protestants and the Catholics really believe in has two parts. It has, from the Christian perspective, an Old Testament and a New Testament, and they need both to be considered. So Jewish scholarship is incredibly important because Jewish scholarship does concentrate on the Hebrew Bible, which is more or less identical to the Christian New Testament, and does give people of all faith commitments or of no faith commitments, various ways of reading that particular text, understanding what it means, and understanding how it might be relevant to people's lives. And let me say one last thing about that. And this actually goes back to one of the most memorable letters I ever got as a scholar. Soon after, I co-edited with Professor Adele Berlin of the University of Maryland a book called The Jewish Annotated New Testament, Jewish Annotated Old Testament. I did the Jewish Annotated New Testament as well with Amy Jill Levine. But the Jewish Annotated, the Jewish Study Bible, now I'll get it right, the Jewish Study Bible with Adele Berlin, dealt with the entire Hebrew Bible, including Isaiah chapter 53, which is an incredibly important chapter for the Christian community, but not for the Jewish community. This is a chapter which is later called, the name is only a little more than a century old, the suffering servant, but that image of a servant who suffers is very central in large segments of the New Testament. And a woman wrote to me and said, Christian woman said, "Thank you very much for co-editing this particular book. It never occurred to me that I, as a Protestant, might want to think about how the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament was read before the time of Jesus, how Jews might read it as well now, and how it could be read independently of the New Testament." So my interest is not in saying that New Testament readings are wrong or impossible, but a lot of the work that I've done in, for example, the Jewish Annotated New Testament or the Bible with and without Jesus, both of which I wrote or edited with Amy Jill Levine, are to show that these are very complicated books, and each religious tradition needs to respect the way in which the other religious tradition deals with them and understands them. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brettler. I think the series was eye-opening for many of our audience, and we have people here from all over the world. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at future Beit Avichai events.